A witch ought never be frightened in the darkest forest, because she would be sure in her soul that the most terrifying thing there was her. A witch doesn't always have to be with a cat on a broom. So light a fire and listen to the story about the witches that were the kindling for capitalism.
The heretic, disobedient woman who dared to live alone. The obeah woman who poisoned master's food and inspired the hag spinster, the midwife, the prostitute, the pauper, the slave. These were the witches that were the kindling of capitalism.
It is I, Lady Hexera, to give you the good news about witchcraft. But this isn't the witchcraft you were taught in school by the phallogocentric historians. This is all about what you should know. Today we'll explore the introduction to the book Caliban the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by philosopher Sylvia Federici. If you think you know about witch hunts, you're wrong. Bubkiss. Fake news. We weren't devil worshippers driven mad by our intense lust for Satan's ding-a-ling.
As if!
We were the women, like myself, who didn't behave, and that was something capitalism simply couldn't tolerate. Even the unspeakable tortures to which the accused women were subjected acquire a different meaning when we conceive of them as a form of exorcism against their powers. Caliban the Witch attempts to reconstruct history from a feminist lens, thereby revealing hidden forms of exploitation and domination in the before and genesis of capitalism.
Throughout this book, Sister Federici is in constant conversation with various warlocks throughout the ages. Warlocks such as William Shakespeare, Karl Marx, and Michel Foucault. In her critique, she liberates women from a male-centered history that has covered over them for centuries. From Shakespeare, we see a representation of the time period Sister Federici focuses on, the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the 16th and 17th centuries. From Marx, Sister Federici takes the labor theory of value, the hypothesis that economic value is largely created by workers, those who do the work, and drives it to its logical conclusion by including women. Since the 1970s, Sister Federici was involved in the wages for housework movement. This movement stated that housework, or reproductive work, i.e. the labor one does to reproduce the species, gestation, birthing, cleaning, feeding, educating children, and so on and so forth, created just as much value as the productive work that occurred at factories or plantations, and therefore those who do housework, mainly women, should receive a wage for reproducing the species. Finally, from Foucault, Federici analyzes the different discourses surrounding women during the transition to capitalism, especially around witchcraft.
The scope of our work is broad, connecting the social struggles of the feudal period with the formation of the proletariat. And the task itself is fraught with darkness. Written accounts from this time period are scant, and are often written from the point of view of the nobility, the clergy, the bourgeoisie, the enemies of the witch. My dear Sister Federici puts the witch at center stage as the exemplification of a world of female subjects that capitalism had to crush. The title Caliban the Witch is inspired by Shakespeare's The Tempest. In The Tempest, Caliban the slave is treated as inherently inferior, born of a witch, a native rebel.
Our poisonous slave got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dam. Come forth!
This island's mine! By Sycorax, my mother, which thou takest from me.
Thou most lying slave, whose stripes may move not kindness, I have used thee, filth as thou art, with humane care. If thou neglect'st or dost unwillingly what I command, I'll rack thee with old cramps, fill all thy bones with aches, make thee roar that beasts shall tremble at thy din.
No! Pray you! I must obey. His art is of such power, it would control my dam's god, Setebos, and make a vassal of him.
So, slave, hence.
His Prospero's mother, the witch Sycorax, is entirely absent from Shakespeare's play, described only by the male, noble, European Prospero.
Hast thou forgot the foul witch Sycorax, who with age and envy was grown into a hoop? Hast thou forgot her?
No, sir.
Thou hast this damned witch Sycorax, for mischiefs manifold and sorceries terrible to enter human hearing.
She is branded a foul wretch. Her magic is evil, where Prospero's magic is seen as a good or even a necessary evil to accomplish his end.
Thou was then her servant, and for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands, refusing her grand hests, she did confine thee into a cloven pine, within which rift imprisoned thou didst painfully remain 12 years, within which space she died and left thee there. Thou best knowest what torment I did find thee in. Thy groans did make wolves howl and penetrate the breasts of ever angry bears. It was a torment to lay upon the damned, which Sycorax could not again undo. It was mine art, when I arrived and heard thee, that made gape the pine and let thee out.
Just like with male historians, the witch is entirely covered over. Federici throws the entire play on its head. She rips the hidden witch from the clutches and obscurity of the white man's word and places a fully fleshed out character center stage. Federici liberates the history of the witch.
Quote, Caliban represents not only the anti-colonial struggle, but is a symbol of the world proletariat. And, more specifically, for the proletarian body as a terrain, an instrument of resistance to the logic of capitalism. Capitalism.
Here we are at the origins of this book. So it only makes sense that we review the origins of capital, known as primitive accumulation. Well, apparently there was this old white dude named Karl Marx who coined the term in the 19th century. And he said, and I'm just reading off the Wikipedia page, primitive accumulation is the foundational process which creates the existence of capitalism. Primitive accumulation. Primitive means originary, a precondition, and primitive accumulation are the processes upon which capitalist relations are premised. Can't have a whole lot of capitalism without a lot of primitive accumulation, my dears. It is the initial hoarding of land and wealth that generates capitalism on one side and the wage labor proletariat on the other. Capitalism is only possible with a concentration of capital and labor. Under feudalism, peasants worked on a plot of the lord's land that they could then pass on to their descendants. Peasants had direct access to the means of production and could directly experience the fruits of their labor. But with primitive accumulation, massive amounts of land were hoarded, creating landless peasants that had to sell their labor to survive. This creates the inevitable problem Marx discovered with wage labor: alienation. What is alienation? Well, Marx says,
we proceed from an actual economic fact. Labor not only produces commodity, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity.
And this at the rate at
Been
which it produces
objectified into
commodities
an
in
object,
general.
which
This
has
fact
become
expresses the object at
material.
which labor
It is the
produces.
objectification of labor. Labor's realization is its objectification. Objectification as the loss of the object and bondage to it. So much does the appropriation of the object appear as a strange that the more objects that
Several hours later,
independently as something alien to him, and it becomes a power on its own confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien. Watch out for those aliens.
Did you get all that? Warlocks can be very long-winded with their sorcery. Let me give you a witch's spark notes. Wage workers produce, but do not keep the fruits of their labor. Their labor is appropriated by the boss and turned into capital, which is then used to further the capitalist system of wage exploitation. By appropriating more of the workers' labor, through the objectification of labor and objects, The worker themselves becomes objectified, alienated.
Sister Federici describes primitive accumulation in the transition from feudalism to capitalism as,
Quote, primitive accumulation consists essentially in the expropriation of the land from the European peasantry and the formation of the quote-unquote free, independent worker. This includes the discovery of gold, silver, and mercury in the Americas, genocide of aboriginal populations, the conquest and looting of East Indies, and the African slave trade. Marx believed that primitive accumulation had been beneficial to the proletariat compared to feudalism, and the violence necessary to achieve said accumulation would recede as capitalism advanced. In the end, he thought it would bring about the workers' liberation. These were necessary laws of history, after all.
spoiler alert, he's wrong. Now, Marx examined primitive accumulation primarily through male-waged labor and commodity production. If he had spent much time examining women's experiences during this period, it's unlikely he would have believed primitive accumulation had any liberatory effect. Sister Federici examines the period through a feminist lens and finds a number of consequences unique to women, but no less important in the formation of primitive accumulation that was notably absent from Marx. Through primitive accumulation, she identifies the development of a new sexual relation that excludes women from wage labor and subjugates their labor to the reproduction of the workforce. Women had one job: make babies. Quote, woman signifies not just a hidden history, but a particular form of exploitation. Furthermore, Sister Federici notes the totalitarian measures used to discipline the proletariat, along with disease and famine. She states, far from receding with the advancement of capitalism, capitalism requires violence in times of crisis for another round of primitive accumulation. Federici interfaces the seizure of women's unpaid labor and reproductive labor as a precondition to the rise of the capitalist economy. She places the institutionalization of assaults and prostitution, as well as the blasphemer and witch hunts, trials, burnings, and torment at the center of systemic oppression of women.
Punishments for abortion and contraception were instituted by the church amidst a time period when the Black Plague had decimated the workforce and there was a desperate need to build it back up.
But this time, under capitalist power, where there were no limits to what could be profited off of. And both labor, capital, and resources are free to travel beyond the limits of the Lord's land and prerogatives. While primitive accumulation describes a beginning or genesis of capitalism, Sister Federici stresses that primitive accumulation is a continuing and inherent part of capitalism. Whenever capitalism seems to be in crisis, seems to be exhausted or at its limits, a new round of primitive accumulation allows it to adapt its limits. Through globalization and the invention of neoliberal world banks, Federici says, quote, a new round of enclosures that have expropriated millions of agricultural producers from their land, and the mass pauperization and criminalization of workers through a policy of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, the war on drugs, deregulation of financial markets, so-called free trade agreements, and financial bubble after bubble after bubble are all new rounds of primitive accumulation, providing new fuel for capitalism. Currently, during a global pandemic, still not as bad as the bubonic, in my opinion, large landowners and investment firms are buying up property as rental units to create a permanent rental class. Sister Federici connects the colonial confiscation of early modernity to today's struggles and gives a system for understanding the strategies and tactics of neoliberal global enterprises like the IMF and the World Bank. She teaches us about a recharge cycle of primitive accumulation, by which everything is privatized. A modern circular of enclosures. This was only an introduction to Caliban and the Witch. My point of view is that every woman, like myself, has a witch in her who seeks freedom. Fed up with colonization and globalization, whatever you call it, that limits her. And representing that witch in women, here I am, Lady Hexeride, concluding today's video.